Books is an independent, non-profit press publishing a wide range of titles in what have traditionally been known as belles lettres: fiction, poetry, plays, creative nonfiction, memoirs, philosophy, theology, and cultural criticism. In an era when publishing is increasingly dominated by fads, reductionistic ideologies, and literary gimmickry, Slant upholds traditional literary craft, high production values, and a clear-eyed exploration of both the beauties and the ambiguities of the human experience. To orient everyone to what's going to happen today, allow me to sketch out briefly how the session will go. After a brief biographical introduction, I will ask Rowan to set up for us the pre-recorded scene of an excerpt from the title play from the book we're launching today, Shakeshafte. Then Archbishop Williams and I will engage in a dialogue about all three plays in the collection. While we're doing so, I strongly encourage you to ask questions of your own by typing them into the chat. My colleague Sam Sorich will curate these, and we'll do our best to ask a number of them towards the end of the session. Excuse me. Our guest today really needs no introduction for most of us, I'm sure, but allow me to do the usual. Rowan Williams grew up in South Wales and studied theology at Christ's College, Cambridge. A strong interest in Russian Christianity led to research at Oxford in the religious thinkers of the Russian emigration, and later to a book on Dostoevsky. Ordained in 1977, he worked in pastoral and academic contexts before becoming Anglican Bishop of Monmouth in 1992, and then Archbishop of Wales in 1999. From 2002 to 2012, he was Archbishop of Canterbury, continuing to write on theology, philosophy, and contemporary issues, and retired in 2012 to move back to the university as Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge. Over the years, he has written a number of books, academic and popular, on Christian faith, as well as publishing several collections of poetry and a number of essays on literary themes, including some studies of Shakespeare and a book on tragedy. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, as well as the British Academy. He now lives with his wife, Jane, also a writer and theologian. He lives in Wales with his wife, Jane. Thank you. Sorry. Welcome, Rowan. We're so glad to have you here today.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much for the opportunity of this event and for taking on the book.
Since we'd like to start concretely with an actual experience of the title play, perhaps the first thing you could do for us would be just to set up the scene of itself has some exposition, which is very helpful, I think, for helping the viewers to perceive what's at stake in the play. But just so we at least know enough to get the full measure from this particular recorded scene, why don't you tell us what we're about to see?
Thanks very much, Greg. The premise of the play really goes back to a discovery in the 19th century of the will of a landowner in Lancashire, in the northwest of England. A rich man, a Catholic, therefore somebody involved in rather kind of secretive networks of people, and somebody who clearly had a complicated domestic family life. Well, in this will, he leaves playing clothes and musical instruments to two of his servants. One of them is called Will Shakeshafte, and the other is called Fulk Gillam. And he recommends them to the care of one of his neighbors, one of the Hesketh family. Now, that in itself is pretty routine. Shakeshafte is a surname you find in that area of Lancashire. But since the early 20th century, people have wondered slightly about the curious echo of a rather more familiar literary name there. Shakeshafte is not that far off from the name of a quite famous English playwright. And the connections don't just end there. We know that the schoolmaster in Stratford-upon-Avon, in Shakespeare's last years of study at school, was a Lancashire man, a Catholic, and somebody whose brother became a Jesuit and was martyred for his faith under Queen Elizabeth's reign. We know that this brother returned to England to work in the Jesuit mission in England, along with the very famous scholar and preacher Edmund Campion, also martyred for the faith. We know that Campion travelled extensively in Lancashire, and he stayed with the family of the aforesaid Lancashire landowner, Alexander Houghton, at some point in 1580-1581. The connection between Lancashire and Stratford is a rather unexpected one. It, in some ways, reinforced for some people the persistent rumour that Shakespeare had strong Catholic connections in his family and his background. And some people have said, well, he just might have been working under an alias in Lancashire, a name a bit like his own, but not one that would stand out in the area. Is Shakeshafte Shakespeare? Plenty of scholars return a resounding no to that question and have good reasons for doing it. But the thing about being any kind of literary person is that you're always inclined to think, well, why not? And experiment with that why not. And I found myself asking the question, well, what if Will Shakeshafte really were the aforesaid well-known playwright in his very early youth, his late teens? What if he were at Alexander Houghton's residence in Lancashire, not far from Preston, at the same time as the Jesuit martyr? What might they have had to say to each other? And that's the germ of the play. The characters of the play are all of them figures whose names appear in Alex Houghton's will or in other documents of the period. We know a little bit about Fulk Gillam, the other person mentioned in the will. We know that he came from a family in Chester, connected probably with the Chester mystery plays. About Will Shakeshafte, we know nothing for certain. So let's imagine, let's just let our fancy off the leash for a moment and imagine that a young man with Catholic connections, possibly somebody who might be a promising recruit to the Jesuit mission, but is himself not very convinced of that, let's imagine that he is bundled off by his schoolmaster to a family friend in Lancashire, partly to keep him out of the way of the agents of the state who were pursuing the Jesuits with great relentlessness at this period. Let's imagine that he arrives at Houghton Hall, near Preston in Lancashire, along with Fulk Gillam, and that they are being inducted into their duties and into the tradition of the place by Roger Livesey, the steward, the manager of Alex Houghton's estate. And let's hear how that imagining unfolds in this little bit of the play that follows.
So, you know about the Houghtons?
Some, sir.
Nothing much, sir, except what Master Cotton says.
And what does Master Cotton say?
He says the Houghtons have one of the great houses in Lancashire, that they hold to the old religion.
Like you do?
Like I do.
Oh, come on, lad. You need to do better than that if you're to manage here. I know you're here because Jack Cotton thinks there's danger for his young men who've been talking with the priests from overseas, but this isn't a safe place. Like Flanders, the bloody Emperor's court. If you're here, you take the same risks. You need to know it's worth it. So do we.
Yes, sir. I hold to my father's faith.
But I hear that still leaves a fair bit open. I know it wasn't your choice to come.
No, sir.
Well. Any road, there's more you need to know. Master Alex is a sick man. It comes and goes, but the doctor knows there's a tumour. And it'll likely kill him. So you keep out of his way. And don't make trouble in the village. Anything that draws attention here is trouble, right? The agents will be around here and there, and they'll be glad to pay us a visit. Maybe more. Folk, you know about the master's brother that built the hall?
Master William?
Aye, Master William. He went abroad so as not to pay the church fines. They confiscated his land. And Master Alex and the other brother, they worked to keep him overseas so he wouldn't come back and be jailed or hanged. But he thought they were after his goods, and they quarreled. And then he died last year. Which is why Master Alex is head of the family now and living in this hall. The point is, after all that, there's a good many folk have good reason to keep their eyes on the Houghtons and what goes on in their houses. So you give them no occasion, right?
Right.
Master Cotton says you have some other visitors?
Does he now? Well, that's the other reason you keep quiet. Plenty to do here with teaching the youngsters their music, writing for the revels, whatnot. And in case you're thinking, there's women enough here so you don't have to be down in the village all the time.
Who is it we teach? Is it the master's children?
He's got none. Well, I've got one daughter out of wedlock, 20-something now, married to a man over by Charnock, used to be cook here. Poisonous bitch. You don't need to know, except keep out of her way. No. There's the children of the gentry on this estate and the next one or two that get sent here for their nurture. 9 of them last time I counted. Wootons, Savages, Pembertons.
And the other visitors, do they come here to teach as well?
Don't be too sharp for your own good. Aye. They come. They have things to say. And the less you have to say about them, the better. There is one coming next week. Master Hastings. Belongs to the company, if that means anything to you.
What company's that?
We had them visit back home. Big secret. Priests from overseas, only they call themselves the Company of Jesus, the Society of Jesus, and they make this promise to...
I said, don't be too sharp. What the company means to you and me is that from next week there'll likely be more eyes on this house than usual, so you watch and keep quiet. And if you recognize this man who's coming, this Hastings, you don't say a word, right? Look, you'll find it strange these first days, especially you will. They'll be laughing at your voice, whatnot. But don't fret. Keep busy. Marjorie will show you where to eat today and where you get your liveries and the rest. God keep you. I have to ride down to Ashcross with Rob. Find out what happened to the bloody saltfish that's due.
Oh, that's lovely. I should stop just for a moment here to offer yet another round of thanks to Scott and Pam Nolte for helping me to have this recording made. They're dear friends and have the founders of Taproot Theater here in Seattle, and also to the actors, to Terry Moore, Tallis Moore, and Scott Nolte himself for acting out the scene for us. Now, as tempting as it is to plunge directly into the play Shakeshafte, I want to step back for a moment and simply ask you this, Rowan. We've heard in your biography about all the different genres that you've written in: theology, spirituality, literary criticism, cultural analysis, poetry. Whatever possessed you to try your hand at playwriting? Did you have any experience of the theater when you were in school or university that left an itch that eventually needed to be scratched?
I think that's exactly it, really. Yes, it's an itch that was waiting to be scratched. When I was at school, I did quite a bit of amateur theatre, and when I was a student as well. It's sort of the unlived life taking its revenge, as they say. But also my son is in the theatre business, so he keeps me up to scratch on these things. And we talk a lot about theatre. It's always been a real fascination. And I suppose, yes, I wanted at some point to explore various things a bit more. But it wasn't quite as deliberate as all that. It was really just rereading a book on this period, this particular theory about Shakespeare's youth, and suddenly thinking, So what if? And then, rather to my surprise, a whole scene of conversation between Shakeshaft and Edmund Campion started to unfold in my mind. And then, rather as with a poem, you start with a line or an image and you think, now where does that fit in? What goes round it? I found myself with this conversation and thinking, what goes round that? What's the frame in which that might make sense? And then sat down and the rest is history, as they say.
Yes, indeed.
Can I just add my thanks, though, to the actors there who did such a fantastic job on that short piece. I can't imagine a better realization of those voices. So thank you very much for that.
Indeed. Now, of course, every literary genre has formal elements that allow you to do things that you can't quite do in the same way in other genres. So what does the medium of drama enable you to do that other forms of writing haven't for you? Or is it just the subject matter that somehow fell into this format rather than a literary criticism?
It's a very good question, because I think that is exactly it, that some genres allow you to do different things. Drama, like fiction, allows you to stage a conversation, indeed to stage an argument, and to stage it not in terms of ordered pros and cons, but in the way you might actually move through an argument in real life and real time. So it doesn't all come at once. People shift their ground a bit. People discover as they talk what they mean, just as we do in real life. And I've never had enough of an ear or eye for plot and so forth to make me a novelist. But here was a ready-made story, and I wanted to see how that argument, as I say, in real time and real language might unfold. The argument really between someone who is discovering that they're wholly committed to the world of the imagination in an unprecedented way, and somebody who knows that they're totally committed to the world of faith in a particular way. And because I don't think that's a zero-sum game, as I don't think you do either, I wanted to stage that and just see what changes as that conversation is spelled out.
Yes, indeed. Well, just again, to resist the temptation to plunge immediately into Shakeshaft, let me ask you, have you been able to see any of your plays on the stage? And if so, what was the experience like? What did you learn from seeing actors bring your work to life?
It's a rather terrifying experience, actually, because the things that make sense in your ears don't necessarily make sense when you hear them from somebody else's lips on a stage, and you think, is anybody else making sense of this? But yes, I have seen both Shakeshaft and Lazarus in performance. The short play Lazarus was directed by Josie Rourke, no less, for whom I've got the most enormous admiration. And there I found the experience was almost entirely positive. I thought, yes, that's really very much what I was feeling my way for. And I felt that all the actors have really got this. Shakeshaft I've seen on stage once, the first performance, which was in my hometown of Swansea some years ago. And they did a fantastic job of it, really wonderful. But it also made me see some things that needed a bit of tightening, some things that needed a bit of loosening, some things which I thought would sound like speech on the page and didn't when they were actually spoken. And I also discovered meanings that I hadn't intended, not in any bad way, but thinking, oh yes, that line could be read like that, couldn't it? How very interesting. I didn't know that was there. And feeling that was part of the discovery of it all. The third play, the one about the poet and artist David Jones, I've heard in a rehearsed reading, but haven't seen on stage. And that rehearsed reading was very important indeed in helping me think of the structure, how you actually shape the play, where the point of tension comes, where the watershed moments are. Because I think my first draft was a bit sprawling and really needed some questions put about its rhythm, about how it rose to a point and relaxed. Because as with any piece of art, you have to find that, well, that very elusive point where things come together, clench, as it were, slip into place, and then unfold and allow something else to move on. And I don't think I got it in that first draft. So again, a very important experience, hearing the words. But I think the most terrifying thing was having my son alongside me on a couple of those occasions and thinking, what on earth does he, as a drama student, as a writer and a director, what on earth does he make of this? Is this the ultimate paternal embarrassment being inflicted on the poor thing?
I'm sure it came off well on that score.
Well,
All
that's
right.
all on speaking terms.
We don't have to hold back anymore. I've exhausted my preliminary questions. So yes, love to dive into the specifics of Shakeshafte, and I'll just treat the plays in order that they're published in the book. So you've told us about the genesis of the play. I'm interested in pursuing something that was very evident from the scene that we just saw, and that was an environment tense with fear and suspicion, with fraught implications for what can be said and what can't be said. The obvious point being that Catholics, or at least Catholic priests like the Jesuits, were being hunted down and executed at the time by Queen Elizabeth's agents. Now, this is a difficult question because you don't want to force an answer to this, and please don't, but it still makes me wonder, do you find any resonances between that sort of environment of fear, suspicion, the difficulty of what to say, what not to say, and our own time? Or is that just truly the mere historical circumstance of material that interested you?
I don't think I'd have written the play if I hadn't found some resonance there, but it's one that runs in a number of different directions. First of all, there's what you might call the very obvious sense in which we've been in the last 20 or 30 years in a state of profound collective anxiety about enemies within, and whether it's Britain, the IRA campaigns of the 70s and 80s, whether it's the Al-Qaeda, ISIS anxieties, the position of Catholics in 16th century England, the perception of Catholics was like that. People were constantly expecting to come across conspiracies, people undermining the state, undermining the status quo. So there's that. But turning it around, there's also that sense of what then can you say? What does the minority actually feel about itself? And I was trying to get myself into the mind of a rather bewildered Catholic minority in England, people who would have had very little patience with conspiracies to overthrow Queen Elizabeth, but were also, if you like, carrying the burden of the perception of their society that if you were a Catholic, you had to be a traitor. And I think sometimes of Muslim communities that I know in our own country who have carried that kind of projection, suspicion, in a very big way in the last decade or two. And then finally, there's that other pervasive anxiety in our culture at the moment about freedom of speech. Everybody, left, right, and center, is very ready to say that their freedom of speech is being threatened. And I think that's a very strange position for us to be in. It's as if everyone feels like a persecuted minority at the moment in our culture. And the so-called culture wars are not really helping us get much of a real intellectual grip on what the issues are. Because I think what's behind that is one of the issues that the play tries to tackle a little bit. What happens when a society has lost any sense of a grand narrative, any sense of a common culture where even if you disagree, you sort of know what you're disagreeing about? And I think what people sense in the play, or what people are expressing a bit in the play, is the beginnings of that very typical modern anxiety, which I've expressed in the play in terms of, do we know the script any longer? Are we just being pushed on stage into a play we haven't rehearsed? We don't know what to say, and so we don't know what we can say. And so the whole idea of the common culture itself begins to disappear. Now, again, part of what the play is saying is that you have a heroic and saintly figure like Campion saying, well, actually, if we put enough prayer and effort into this, we can turn the clock back. And you have the young man saying, but what if you can't turn the clock back? And I wanted those both to be serious positions. And young Shakeshaft recognizing that the question that Campion's trying to answer is a real question, even if he can't answer it in the same orthodox and Catholic way that Campion does. So yes, I think there are some crossovers there.
Yeah, yes, indeed. Now, of course, as you've said, both in terms of what inspired you originally to write the play and what the play is pointing toward and building toward throughout, is this exchange between Shakespeare and Campion. But before we speak about that directly, I was struck by the way that you contextualize that encounter. That is, the individuals in the play that one might call minor characters, Will's peer Fulk, women like Marjorie and Meg, are given rounded portraits. And in fact, there are romantic undercurrents or sexual undercurrents or some combination thereof, I suppose, as is only the case with human beings. And I think that they really do echo and prepare for the larger themes, particularly in, I think, this question of otherness and our capacity to experience something outside of ourself, to see through the eyes of others. And in a way, I mean, romantic love is calling us to that, to some extent, to a kind of self-denial that involves an imaginative leap toward the other. So could you talk for a few minutes just about the way that yes, we're going to have the faith versus imagination theme, but you give a kind of, you give flesh in a direct sense to that in these other little currents that are going on in the play as well.
No, I'm glad you found the characters rounded there. They are an important part of the whole, no doubt about it. And one of the things I was trying to do with young Will's involvement with both Marjorie and Meg was to try and imagine the very, very curious kind of sensibility that the writer of the sonnets or of Much Ado About Nothing or Othello might have had as a very young man, discovering that his understanding of sexual involvement and commitment wasn't straightforward, that there was always in it, it's something that Marjorie talks about, always in it an element of almost wanting to devour and possess the other. He's so passionate about understanding and entering the other, inhabiting the other, that it feels to the other like being eaten alive. And Marjorie, who is I hope, comes across as a fundamentally sensible and sensitive personality. Marjorie is hurt and bewildered, and Meg, who is not a sensible and sensitive person, but a person with huge bitterness and the suggestion of abuse and neglect in the background. Meg wants to exploit Will in turn and turn the sexual encounter into a battlefield where she has to win. So yes, there is something in those depictions which looks at, if you like, the shadow side of what the great imaginative artist may be like as a human being. People have very different views of what William Shakespeare was like as a human being. His friends all say, basically, what a nice chap. He's sweet. It's an adjective often used. He's companionable. He's easy to get on with. And you scratch a bit, and there is an undercurrent of some real ruthlessness in some of what we know about him. And that doesn't surprise me at all. You could say the same of Tolstoy. You could say, well, you could say it in spades about Wagner, but let's not go there. But, you know, very many really great artists are deeply shadowed personalities. And I didn't mean Will in the play to be a kind of unshadowed hero. So yes, there's real continuity going on there.
And I think what comes along with that is somewhat sobering reminder that it perhaps is too easy to simply lionize the imagination with a capital I, and which I probably have done, and guilty of in my own way, because there is a flip side to everything. There's a kind of shadow side to it, not only in terms of the corruption of a human personality, but in terms of a kind of reductionism. Imagination is a powerful instrument, isn't it? But like any instrument, it can be wielded in different ways.
Exactly. And for all that I really, really, really love Shakespeare as an artist, and would willingly spend a lot of the rest of my life just reabsorbing the plays and the poems, I think it is important not to have that kind of artistic hagiography, and to say, well, genius comes with a cost, and it's a human cost. I meant the audience to feel Marjorie's desolation in the play. She loves Will. She wants him to stay. She wants to build something with him. And she knows at some level that's just absolutely not going to happen. And I think the reason for ending the play with that rather sad little Elizabethan song was to leave people with that sense of the cost of genius. But no theoretical way of resolving that. But the other side of that is trying to get across that Shakespeare, Shakeshafte, Will in the play, actually does at some level also know what Campion is talking about. He knows why faith matters to Campion. He can't quite make it his own, but that's why, again, at the crucial climax of their conversation, he kisses the priest's hand. He recognizes something. And I wanted to leave that as an image of, if you like, imagination at its highest, still almost through gritted teeth, saying, I know there's something I can't do. I know there's a grace that I can't deliver for myself. And Shakespeare is very interested in grace, very, very interested in grace. And the language of grace, of course, permeates the last plays so very strongly. And they are in some ways his most Christian product. And I think they are so because there's a recognition, especially in the last lines of The Tempest, a recognition of what art can and can't do. Prospero coming forward at the end of the Tempest and saying, well, you've seen what magic can do, but now you, the audience, you have to show what prayer can do. Because the magician is always trapped in their own magic. And only prayer can set you free. It's a pretty strong statement in that play. And I think about it a lot.
Indeed. Now, we've been talking naturally a lot about the Shakespeare character. Let's take a moment just to reflect on Campion, the figure of Hastings, aka Campion, because I think he, is very much an equal partner, at least in terms of the intellectual tussle.
Yeah.
That is the heart of the play. I mean, he's obviously formidable. He is, confident, self-possessed, authoritative. Everything you would want in someone who's a representative of orthodoxy and authority in the church. And yet, he's not without a modicum of worldly wisdom, even compassion in the course of the play. So was he a challenging figure to bring to life? I mean, after all, you still wear a collar. So your life is bound up with this institution, with authority, with all of those things.
Indeed, and I still do wear a collar, literally and metaphorically, as a priest. And I suppose, yes, there was an element in creating Campion of trying to think, what does a good priest sound like? Because I have been privileged to know quite a few. And that's definitely in there. And I wanted to, yes, to do some justice to the historical Campion, who certainly a formidable figure in just the sense you mention, a man of immense erudition, creativity, courage, eloquence. And I wanted that. I also wanted to show him, if you like, with his collar slightly undone, sitting by the fire late at night, actually sharing with this rather uncannily sympathetic young man what the real problems were, so that he's able to say, look, I know people say this, people say that, but what this is basically about is there a ship to carry us home? And saying at one point, and I said it with a certain wryness in my own mind as I wrote, Campion saying, I can understand the hardline Calvinist better than some of the people around here in the Reformed Church of England who really don't seem to care very much. And it's what people have often said about the Church of England, not very fairly, but it's there. And so I felt that had to be there in somewhere on the landscape.
Right. Well, my grand finale question for Shakeshaft has really, in a sense, been answered by everything you said up till now. So at the risk of kind of shooting a dud here, let me just say, what I find so compelling about the confrontation of these two worldviews, these two approaches to reality. Well, part of what I find so compelling is that you've built up to it in a way that none of what has come before is disposable. It's all organic and connected. But it's a kind of an ironic juxtaposition for me, because I've been an advocate of something called Christian humanism. But you could in some ways say that the very tension or encounter is placing those terms against each other in your play. The representative of faith and the representative of imagination, as you say. So as our exit from this particular play, I think just what lingering thoughts do you have about this in terms of what you hope people will take away? I mean, presumably the ultimate Christian humanist response, I've jokingly said, is both and rather than either or. So I'm hoping that part of what you think comes out of this confrontation in the end becomes both and. So tell me if I'm wrong.
I hope you're right. And I certainly didn't want to present the encounter as I said earlier, a zero-sum game between faith and imagination. But it was a time of almost unimaginably tough decisions for people. When you could say Campion had tried the synthesis, the humanist synthesis. Campion had been at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, and he'd written poems and masques and so forth for the emperor's court, as well as writing theology and philosophy. He'd done the sophisticated humanist business, and then he'd been sent off to godforsaken remote parts of Britain at a time when his faith and his commitment were regarded as de facto absolutely dangerous and diabolical. And his choices were not the choices of, if you like, the humanist in the study. And I think it's important that there is some recognition there also that the choices of the humanist in the study are good and can be life-giving, and there are circumstances where they don't map easily onto the choices people actually make. And then you have Will himself finding Campion's own simplicities not quite where he feels the ballast of human experience lies, and yet not wanting to say no. So I think, as I say, the way in which at the end Will does kiss Campion's hand, and Campion does say, "You might make it back yet by a very long route into the place where I live."
Yes.
Those are the kind of cracks I want to leave open there.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, it also is very reminiscent of you might say the poles represented by Thomas More on the one hand and Erasmus on the other.
Yeah.
Erasmus being the quintessential armchair humanist in
Yeah.
that sense, who mourned his friend, and yet was probably in the end a little baffled, by More's choices. But
Yes, as so many people were. And I think More, rather like Campion, would have said at the end of the day, there is a yes or no here. And however you dress it up or however you try to soften it, there is something of a yes or no when you're faced with, yes, with the violence of totalitarianism. It's a bit like that that little book by Hans Urs von Balthasar, the great Swiss theologian, which he called Cordillera oder der Ernstfall in German. Cordillera, or what happens when things get serious. And Balthasar there is pushing back a bit against a particular kind of slightly over-optimistic Christian Catholic humanism of the 60s and 70s, the Vatican II and post-Vatican II period, when it seemed a bit easier to say, well, everything sensible and enlightening that has ever been said is perfectly at home with the Catholic faith. And Balthasar saying, yeah, but actually, what if it isn't always?
Yeah. Well, indeed, and that's the almost the tragic dimension of Christian humanism is, it's like walking a tightrope, right? These forces pulling you on either side towards liberalism or conservatism, and they're powerful forces, and the voices often are compelling, help us make a stand. And I understand why people get drawn that way, but I think you capture the tensions here so well. Well, couple quick notes here. Let's shift over to the second play. But while doing so, let me just remind everyone that you are very free to ask a question. So please do consider that we're going to leave some time for Rowan Williams to be able to speak to anything that you would like to ask him. Preferably in relation to this book or the literary dimension, but whatever we see that's good, we'll send on to him. Now, so second play, very different sort of play, ambiance, time period. It's called The Flat Roof of the World, and you can probably explain that in the course of your exposition, but you've almost done the opposite in this play. You've chosen, instead of choosing to write about somebody almost everybody knows about, Shakespeare, you're writing about someone almost nobody knows about, which I know grieves both of us, but it's true. It's just the fact that David Jones, this 20th century Anglo-Welsh poet and visual artist who we admire so much and want to champion and bring to the attention of others, he's just had a very difficult time getting the kind of attention that he wants. So why don't you just start off by jumping directly into what you value about David Jones and what led you to not only write this play, but you've also covered him in Grace and Necessity, and I'm sure, in passing in other books. So why should we care about this very obscure, somewhat troubled and troubling figure of David Jones?
I first came across David Jones as a poet in my late teens. And I think because I was coming at him from a particular angle with a lot of exposure in my childhood and teens to the Welsh literary and legendary tradition, I was almost immediately electrified by the way in which Jones picks up and works with the themes of this traditional mythology and literary tradition, especially the Arthurian tradition. But of course, in his later work, he more and more feeds back into the Christian narrative and the narrative of the Mass, the Eucharist, feeds back into that all the insights, all the dimensions that the literary and legendary tradition give him. So it's as if the legendary background of both Welsh and classical mythology is all in some sense a set of marginalia, marginal notes to the one great story on which everything converges, and that is the story which is enacted in the Mass. And when I was 16, 17, beginning to be really passionately interested in theology as well as in the literary tradition, this hit me with such force, feeling that yes, that's the world I feel is most real, most engaging. And as I've often said, I was fortunate enough in my teens to have guidance from a parish priest who consistently gave the message that being a Christian, being a sacramental Christian particularly, was an enormous expansion of your imaginative horizons rather than a reduction. And I've never forgotten that and never lost my gratitude for that. So that was what first struck me. Here's a writer who can hold those things together, the sacramental theological vision, the complex, rich, baffling classical and Celtic mythological tradition, and a lot more besides. Then as I read more of Jones and began to look at his paintings, his engravings, his etchings and so forth, I began to realize that the method he always used, both in his verbal and his visual art, was encouraging you to be an archaeologist, to see through surfaces, to see into an image, to level after level after level. In his poetic work, he's layering, building layers of narrative, discourse, and imagery one on top of the other. And to some extent, you can see he's doing that in a lot of his visual work too. But the center of all of it is, of course, the great meditation on the experience of the trenches of the First World War, in parenthesis, which he published in the 1930s after working on it for the best part of 20 years, where the very vividly and concretely evoked experience of being a private soldier in the trenches is, if you like, layered onto the history of, let's say, the 100 Years' War in the Middle Ages, which is layered onto classical Homeric tropes and elements, again, of traditional Welsh literature and culture, and all finally layered on the great act of redemptive violence, which is the cross. So, in parenthesis, is where you go to see what, everything that's going on in a way in the whole of David Jones's work. So yes, that's what really struck me, that archaeological sense of how the imagination works, looking at the landscape and learning to read it for what's buried underneath it, whether words or pictures. And if you put that together with his own very, very troubled, very vulnerable personal life, it becomes even more poignant. I think it's evident in some of his letters, it's evident in some of his actual production too, that he suffered from seeing too many connections. He was the kind of artist who sees too much for comfort. He couldn't hold it all together. And part of his inability to cope with a lot of everyday life is to do with that sense of almost the systems being overloaded. So that's part of the impulse that led me to explore a bit in his biography there.
Right. Now, I could be wrong about this, but I think part of the challenge facing Jones in terms of reputation is, and also central to the play as you've written it, is his association with Eric Gill, the Catholic artist and essayist and typographer, who is a very controversial figure because of the revelations of some, very troubled, abusive behavior. And admittedly, Jones is not considered, is not under suspicion for any of that, but there's guilt by association. Some people just, I don't want to think about that. And Gill's behavior undermines people who want to champion the kind of larger Catholic aesthetic that he and Jones were both interested in. So how did you take on such, because that does at least tangentially factor into the play. You've taken on a very difficult topic that others, I think, would have either treated it as a mere hatchet job allegory, made Gil into a monster, but he again somehow remains human despite the heinousness of the things that he did.
Yes, I really struggled when I first read about Gil's behavior. I read Fiona McCarthy's wonderful biography of Gil when it appeared back in the 90s. And Gil was somebody I'd admired a lot as an artist and as a writer. And I found it just profoundly shocking that there was this background of, well, incestuous abusive behavior with his daughters, as well as a whole range of other things. And I couldn't and I can't understand it. It's almost as if Gil has a kind of absolute tone deafness in certain areas of the moral life. And yeah, what is also rather shocking is that some of his early biographers knew about this and concealed it. But yeah, we know about that from other contexts, sadly. So I thought if I want to try to do justice to Jones, I've got somehow to factor in the question of what's going on with Gil. And that felt the riskiest bit of the play, and I just do not know if it works. Trying to imagine just a bit, from what little I know of the personalities involved, how Gil thought or failed to think about it, but also what his daughter felt and thought about it. Now, she spoke about it a bit in later life. She said more than once that she and her sisters had never known anything different, and they didn't feel their lives had been completely wrecked by their father's abuse. But you think, or I think, can that be? Is that, is that humanly credible? What is the cost? What is the hurt? And just trying to, well, I suppose, to listen for that. And trying to, I found myself in writing the play really fascinated by the figure of Petra. She always comes across in the biographies as a rather enigmatic, almost unnaturally placid figure, a little bit aside from the turmoil of the household. And I thought, so what's the placidity managing? What is it holding? And I found, it sounds ridiculous in some ways, but I found I liked the sound of Petra from what I heard about her. Somebody who had been plunged into a whole lot of, well, to put it mildly, utterly unwelcome complications in her life, and had, so to speak, gritted her teeth and come up to talk about it, think about it, not dramatize and not lie. And that's quite a mixture. So I hope she comes across as an impressive figure in the play, because she's certainly meant to be. I wanted people to feel this is a person of colossal moral substance. And that colossal moral substance is partly to do with the colossal moral insult that she's endured. But I remember showing it to a friend of mine who I think understands a bit of what's going on in all of that emotional world, who said to me, "You really are on very thin ice. I'm not sure if I know what to do with it yet."
Well, I applaud your courage, and I think that you don't shrug it off. And I know that the nature of the wounds in these situations is so intense that it is tempting to say that the best response is simply, it's like a flash of the horror is so much that it blinds us, and we can't look at it. But I believe that you've really struggled to incorporate this into the larger themes of the play and asked us to look at something. I mean, I always think of Kurosawa, the great director, saying that the artist is the one who does not look away.
That's a very good definition, I think, because to me, the essential intellectual dishonesty in any work of art or any intellectual system is what it teaches you to ignore, systematically to ignore, who it teaches you to ignore. And I think any art that has any claim at all to be attended to has to, as you say, help you not to look away. I was very interested when I heard the play being read to listen to how Eric Gill himself sounded. And I have to say, the actor who was reading his part nailed it so credibly. I thought, well, yes, here is somebody who is, in a sense, completely illiterate about a whole area of himself and his emotions and his impact on people. And with some little bit of his mind, he knows that there's something he doesn't know, but he doesn't fully know what he doesn't know. And he plunges on, not really bothering very much about what's left behind, which is why the image with which his final speech ends is a rather almost desperate moment of self-justification, as it would say, well, it didn't really hurt, did it? And then I've asked for the spotlight to go onto the broken doll that Petra has left on stage, as what I'd like people to remember from that speech.
Right. And again, I would say that, trauma is at the heart of this play. And it's of course foolish to compare types of trauma with each other. Each one has its own, dignity and needs to be accorded as such. But and it's not putting anything on an equivalent plane, but there's war, there's sexual abuse, and what these things seem to do, though somewhat in common, they share some traits. I mean, it seems to be a kind of fragmentation, a breaking apart of world and meaning. And so it seems to me that Jones's own desperate attempt to want to try to find the connections between things does seem to me ultimately to be a deeply healthy response to trauma. Would you say that was part of your own approach? Or
absolutely, I think that is very precisely what's
I mean, Eliot says, "I have shored these fragments against my
ruin." Yes, and Jones quotes that more than once, of course, and I think that's exactly what he thought he was doing. Certainly in parenthesis, but also in some of his visual work. He wants there to be room for everything that matters. Put it that way. He wants there to be room for everything that matters. But an awful lot of things matter, and no one artistic sensibility, however generous, however extraordinarily fertile, as with Jones, no one sensibility can do it all. Which is why, I suppose, again, Jones takes you back to the sacramental center. Something is done to hold it all together, but not by the artist. The artist has every opportunity of witnessing to this, pointing into it, and isn't just, serving a religious agenda by saying so. It's deeper than that. And what that deeper means is, I suppose, part of what the play tries to explore, and again, leaving the image of the crucified somewhere in the mix towards the end.
Yes, and the modernist style of both poetry and visual art seemed almost perfectly suited to tackling these things. Or again, they're all of one. This is of one piece, I guess one would say. The style and the history of the world that the style is responding to, a world that was fragmented, a world where technology, but also mental disturbance, made us aware of how the mind and the brain can be overloaded, and this fragmentation, this desire for, and corresponding desire for unity, this the awareness of kind of simultaneity of this things happening, these layers cohering, you might say, to use a Charles Williams style term. That feels to me like it's part of what you're exploring.
Certainly, yes. I think Jones is saying, in a world where the fragmentation is so deep, then the task of holding it together is that much more costly. And on the surface, the fragmentation is his own experience of the war and the horrors of the trenches and the horrors of the Battle of Mametz Wood and his own wound and all the rest of it, and his own neurosis. Somewhere under the surface is the unspoken fragmentation of Petra's life by abuse and neglect and all the rest of it. And yes, the cost of being that kind of artist in that kind of world and that kind of relationship. I suppose that's really what the play is about. And the title, The Flat Roof of the World, I know it's an odd one, but it's an image that Jones uses about the experience of getting out of the trenches and going forward in formation towards the enemy through the mist in an early morning where you can't see the ground in front of you, you can't see the trees above you. And he said it was like walking on the flat roof of the world. And I think one of the hidden elements in that extraordinary image is if you're walking on a flat roof in mist, you won't know where the edge is.
Indeed. Well, again, I commend you. This play and David Jones, they have what we call an uphill battle, to fight for attention, and the various ways they can be dismissed or ignored. And I'm very grateful that you've championed Jones, and that this play gives us a very complex and yet poignant insight into him as an artist and as a human being. So thank you for doing that.
Thank
All
you.
right, so we're getting lots of great questions. I have when we've got just under 30 minutes to go in our full 90-minute session. So before we get to those, let me just ask about Lazarus. Tell us a little bit about this. This is different. Both of the others are more like full-length plays with multiple characters. Lazarus is a different beast. It's more, I don't know, it's more a matter of artifice, of characters, emerging from darkness into the spotlight, less conventional in that sense, but maybe even a little liturgical in that way. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Lazarus?
Well, Lazarus was commissioned when the anniversary of the publication of the King James Bible came around in 2011. A bit before that, Josie Rourke, then artistic director at the Bush Theatre in London, proposed to a number of people a sequence of 66 short plays, one for each of the books of the Protestant Bible, that is not the Apocrypha. So it was a sequence simply called 66 books. And we were given a bit of choice as to which books we might address. She mostly went to people who had a bit of an established reputation as writers of plays, and I don't quite know why she knocked on my door, but I'm glad that she did, because it enabled me to say, well, I'd quite like to write something about St. John's Gospel in half an hour. Well, what can you say about St. John's Gospel in half an hour? If you remember the end of John's Gospel, that if all the works that Jesus did were written down, the world could not contain the books that would have to be written. You could almost say the same about John's Gospel. If you said everything that there was to be said about John's Gospel, the world couldn't contain the commentaries. So I thought, what's one of the most focal and compelling episodes in John's Gospel? And for me, it's often been, not always, but often been the raising of Lazarus. And I thought of it partly because, of course, it's a phrase from that story that occurs at the beginning of the Church of England burial rite. The priest walks into the church in front of the coffin, reciting the words from the story, "I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord." And so that gave me the idea of a kind of double or treble frame for the story. A modern, rather secular person puzzling over hearing these words at a funeral. What do they mean? And a kind of recreation of the Lazarus story itself through the voices of Lazarus's sisters and the evangelist. So yes, it's a slightly unusual play in terms of its form, but I wanted the modern voice, the baffled secularist, to have the first word and the last word, and for the short play to be, if you like, the arc, ARC, of the trajectory of this voice coming to begin to see what those words might be. And that's where the imagery comes in, I think, of that speaker suddenly associating the words of John's Gospel with a sound like distant thunder, with the sound of boxes falling over in the room upstairs, with the sound of the wooden gong from a Chinese ceremony, something both resonant and spacious and spare. That's the style of John's Gospel. I think that's part of what I wanted to get through, and that's why, as I say, I wanted that voice, the baffled modern man, to be the opening and closing voice.
Excellent. Thank you. And that actually will, much as I would love to continue talking about Lazarus, that we've got so many good questions that I feel like our best use of time would be turning to those now. And hopefully a little mystery around what you're doing in a Lazarus will draw people to purchase the book and to read it for themselves. So jumping into these questions in the few minutes we have left, here's one. I wonder if you have found the critical response to the plays varies in the secular world versus the Catholic world, or if you find both take different meanings from the work. Maybe by Catholic world, he just means the religious world.
Well, I haven't yet seen the Jones play in performance, so I don't know what an audience reaction would be. I think just listening to what some of the actors have said, I was struck by the fact that the Shakespeare play did clearly engage actors who didn't have a Christian commitment. They were interested by the faith and imagination dialectic. And I think the same was true of the readers for the Jones play. Lazarus was, I think, a bit of an outlier in the 66 book sequence, because not many of the other writers were actually professing Christians. And I think their approach to the texts, the biblical texts they were reflecting on, was a more literary one, in a sense. I was trying to write about the commitment, and so I think it sat a bit uneasily with some of the others. But it's a good question, and if these ever get produced ever again, I shall keep my ears open for that and just be fascinated to hear, because I'd like it to be the case that it's possible to write in a way which can just keep a foot in the door for a theological perspective, which is not just theological in its form.
Now, here's a fascinating one. Why did you decide to study theology at Cambridge when you sat the common entrance exam for English literature? Do you regret the choice, since you seem very invested in the study and production of literature?
No, I don't regret the choice at all, actually, though I did for a bit in my first year as a student, when I was learning the biblical languages and finding it a lot less rewarding in the short term than like indulging myself with contemporary poetry or whatever. I think I settled for theology because I was already pretty sure that I wanted to offer myself as a candidate for ordained ministry. And I knew that had to be the center. That's where the ballast was for my my life and my thinking. And I suppose over the years, it's come and gone. I've written theology, I've written poetry, perhaps in recent years a bit more outside the obvious theological boundaries. Though that being said, I'm still writing about technical theological questions, still writing and still preaching. So no regrets. I'm glad that I had the opportunity as a teenager to immerse myself in a literary world. I'm glad that I was made to work hard at the scriptural and traditional sources of Christian theology as an undergraduate, and not just be allowed to drift off into too much impressionistic religiosity, as you might say. I'd have my nose rubbed in the Greek fathers and all the rest of it, and having to do the translation exercises.
Here's an excellent one. David Jones is obscure and seems doomed to remain that way despite high esteem in certain quarters. J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium, by contrast, is about as famous as literary work can get. These two men, Jones and Tolkien, had much in common in their lives and interests, though they worked in very different forms and genres and drew upon closely related literary deposits, as Jones would say. Have you ever considered Tolkien and Jones together? And do you think the popularity of the one and the obscurity of the other is due entirely to the different literary forms they worked in?
My word, that's an interesting question. And the short answer is no, I've never tried to put them together. Consciously, I'm aware of them belonging in something of a common world. They had some friends in common, but not very many. And I think what really divides them is that at the end of the day, Jones is a modernist. He says his artistic inspiration comes from the post-impressionist generation of artists, especially in France. His literary style is very much a modernist style. That is, he begins from the fragmentation and he works with it. Tolkien, I think, is resolutely wedded to almost a pre-modern set of assumptions. And I don't say that in any sense evaluatively, just that's where he begins. He thinks it is possible to write the kind of uncomplicated, psychologically straightforward, epic narrative that he himself loved in the medieval and pre-medieval world that he absorbed so deeply. And what's remarkable about Tolkien is that, beginning with that apparently retrogressive, or some people would think even simplistic option, he produces a work of genuine depth and sophistication in The Lord of the Rings, which I once said some years ago is much more of a novel than a myth at the end of the day. He couldn't help himself be that much of a modern. But I think it is partly style. Tolkien is accessible, in a word. He's accessible. And Jones isn't very. And he wouldn't be apologetic about that. I think he would say, well, in the sort of world we're in, there are other considerations than accessibility to be brought in. But it is a fascinating question how these two comparably traditional Catholics could be culturally so different in their reputation and reception, so different in their absorption of at least some of the same currents, their friendships with some of the same people. And I think a kind of Venn diagram of their circles of friends and contacts would be very, very interesting.
I feel somewhat conflicted here because I don't want to be the object of real or virtual tomatoes thrown at me, but if Jones could only get 10% of Tolkien's popularity, it would be a miracle. Yeah, well, enough said. I do not want to get into deep trouble here, but let's continue. could you speak to the role of imagination in knowing for the artist, writer, the theologian, and the scientist? I think of Samuel Taylor Coleridge as a touchstone here, with modern advocates such as Malcolm Guite and Tom McLeish.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful lineup, actually. I think Tom McLeish is emerging more and more as a really substantial, interesting thinker in these areas. And yes, it seems to me that this is something I've said many times of late, I think we've inherited an increasingly one-dimensional picture of what knowledge means, in which the role of intuition and imagination has been minimized. And I think here we need to go back to somebody like Cardinal Newman in that greatest of 19th century philosophical texts, The Grammar of Assent, possibly the finest philosophical work in English, where Newman explores and examines how it is that we actually think. People sort of underrate the care with which Newman focuses in on what it's like to think and to come to conclusions. And so he builds into the process of acquiring knowledge elements of relationship, elements of imagination, and that strange thing which he calls the illative sense. That is the moment where you think, as it were, oh, but it's got to go there next. It's not an argumentative compulsion. That's the clear next step, but a sense of another kind of necessity. I see where this is going. And yes, the next step must be. It's very, very like Wittgenstein, talking about how you learn to continue a series, a not very obvious series of numbers or geometric figures. And you sort of leap ahead, not by strict reasoning, but you say, that's what the obvious next step would be. And imagination does that. It sees, as you might say, half the lower half of a circle, say, and imagines what it would take to complete that would be rounding it off. That's what it must be. And imagination does something like that with the imperfect material that human experience delivers, or the inconclusive material. It says, yes, but, and leaps to that more global, more comprehensive picture. Now, that in itself becomes challengeable and revisable in turn, but without that moment of, that's where it must go. As when you're writing a poem, sometimes there's a feeling, that's got to be the next line, that's the next image, and you try to explain the compulsion about it. Very difficult. And the most famous example is wherein, I think it's one of the late quartets, Beethoven writes beside the music, muss es sein, es muss sein. Must this be? Yes, it must be. And what does he mean by that? Just that sense, I think, of this is where it's got to go.
Here's one which the questioner admits that it may not be directly related, but he says he'd love to hear you talk about Henry Vaughn. He wonders if you see any connections or fail to see connections between his poetic and that of his fellow Welshman Jones, or even his early modern peer Shakespeare, and where might you see his work falling in, or what might you see it telling us about that faith imagined Christian humanist dialectic that you examine in Shakeshaft? So Henry Vaughn.
Well, how long have we got? I mean, Vaughn is one of my great enthusiasms, actually, and I think a deeply underrated poet. And I think, actually, it's something I've tried to argue once or twice about Vaughan. He, too, is dealing with a fragmented society. He's writing in the Commonwealth period. A lot of his work, anyway, comes from that period, where the church that he loves, the Anglican church to which he's totally devoted, has become, well, rather like the Catholic Church of Shakeshafte, has become an underground and persecuted body, not as severely as in the 16th century with Elizabeth Tudor and the Catholics, but still it's been stripped. And what Vaughan is doing, as I think has been said by one or two critics, is almost building up a coherent symbolic and contemplative world out of the fragments. All right, so you can't go to church in the way you used to. What do? You quarry the fragments. You rethink, you reimagine the world of theological and religious reference through the images, the narratives that you're left with, the memories of scripture and liturgy. And you rebuild the church in the fields of the Usk Valley at night. And I think there is in Vaughan what there isn't in George Herbert, that sense that something has been almost irretrievably broken, but you can't just sit with the brokenness, you've got to work with it. Herbert has his own force and edginess about the internal struggles of the believing soul, and it's immensely powerful. Vaughan does it slightly differently, although he often recycles Herbert's themes and images. He does it in the wake of an external collapse of meanings and connections and images and symbols. And I think that's part of to my mind, the enormous fascination of the relation between those two very great figures. So I think if you wanted to build a connection between Vaughan and Jones, that might be one place to start.
Beautiful. Well, the final question is going to be a test, I think, even for you, Rowan, who you think well on your feet. But this question strikes me as the ultimate think on your feet question, because here it is. It says that in the last few weeks, we've lost Desmond Tutu, E.O. Wilson, and Joan Didion. What can you say to any commonality or legacy of those three individuals?
Yes, I see what you mean. A great scientist, a great literary figure, and a great, what should we say, a great fighter of the spirit. All of them have in common, I think, the capacity to see a bit further over the horizon than most of us, to see where things lead, what things imply. Desmond Tutu was able to recognize, in a way which astonishingly few Christians were, that there was something just radically, irreducibly, completely perverse about apartheid and the racial mythology on which it rested. And he was able not only to push beyond that frontier, but to push beyond another frontier and say, and the way to deal with it is not just to reverse the power relations, but to transform them. A great scientist like Wilson would see just that little bit further over the horizon into the connections we make about our biological history. What kinds of being are we? How do we go beyond inherited cliches in understanding ourselves without dissolving our humanity in the process? Joan Didion, like other great writers, once again, sees those connections. I have to come clean and say I don't know her work well, but I would, just on the basis that there is a great writer, I'd say, well, that's what I expect of a great writer. I expect to be surprised, and then I expect to recognize the surprise as something I ought to have spotted, or that is natural to spot. In other words, here is a new world, and my goodness, it makes sense of the old one. And maybe all of them are doing something like that.
Indeed. Well, hats off to you for that. That was quite the challenge, that last question. I want to conclude now by thanking you again, Rowan, for joining us, for giving Slant the honor of being the publisher of your plays, to Sam Sorich for beautifully handling and pulling off today's event, to the actors, and to you, the audience, for coming today. This is being recorded, of course, so you'll be able to tell all your friends to watch it on YouTube when it is posted. You will find that information coming out both on the social media from Slant and also in our e-newsletter, Slantwise, which we invite you to subscribe to stay up to date with the latest of what we're publishing and the events and other things that we're putting together. And again, I want to thank the anonymous donor who made today's event possible by his generous gift. And that's as good a lead-in as I can think of to remind everyone that Slant Books is, as of just a few weeks ago, now an independent, not-for-profit publisher. The kind of literary and belles lettres publishing that Slant wants to do requires more time than the marketplace considers profitable. So to continue to do something which I think many people do still deeply and passionately care about, we hope you will consider helping us continue that tradition. Please visit us at slantbooks.org and clicking on donate. Thanks again to all of you and best wishes for the new year. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.